No, no. Did you go look at that book? You can probably find it on Amazon. So tonight we're going to be in John chapter 4. We're going to be continuing our study on face-to-face with Jesus. Last week we did talk about Nicodemus, who was a famous rabbi and member of the most powerful ruling body of the Jews, and how he came to Jesus to learn about what Jesus gave him was the entrance into the kingdom of heaven. Chapter 3 of John is kind of the center of a section, a theological section, starting in chapter 2 about the passing of the old and the coming of the new. And it is going to, in this lesson, come to its theological conclusion of the passing of the old and the coming of the new. And so we see all of those ideas in chapters 2 through chapter 4. For example, in chapter 2, with the purification is replaced by the wine, and so the water pots are filled. The passing away or completion of that coming in, of course, to the new with the new wine. You have the old temple is replaced by the new meeting place, which is Jesus Christ himself, as he drives out the money changers, and in the end of chapter 2. In chapter 3, the old birth with the new birth. In chapter 4 here, or chapter 3, you say the old baptism at the end of the chapter with the new baptism. So there's this passing away the old and the coming of the new. And so there is an old well and there's a new well here in chapter 4. And so we're going to be looking at the woman at the well of Samaria. This is one of the great exchanges, I think, of all of the face-to-face encounters we're going to deal with. To me, this is one of the most pointed and poignant. But it's interesting. John, remember, is not necessarily giving us a chronological account. He's taking stories and events from Jesus' life, and he is putting them in an order that prove his point. You know, he's got a point that he's making, and he's proving that point by how he puts these stories together. What's interesting is he puts Nicodemus and this woman at the well of Samaria right next to each other. And I think there's a reason for that. When this unsuspecting woman comes face to face with Jesus, she is going to be offered a satisfaction that she has long desired, and appears that she has not been able to get it up to this point. And the great lesson that we're going to find is the gift of God and who it is that speaks to you. Let's begin looking, first of all, at this woman and who she is. Basically, when you look at how John puts them together, she is everything Nicodemus was not. Or everything that Nicodemus was, she is not. For example, Nicodemus was an educated man. In fact, he was an educator. He was a rabbi. For everything we can tell about her, there's no education there. He was a man of reputation. People looked at him, and he had a good reputation. People liked him. That's why he served on the council. She had no reputation. He had influence with people. Are you a teacher of Israel and you don't know these things? You look at how you have done all of these things, and yet you don't understand some of the simplest things from the Old Testament. And so there was some influence that he wielded, and Jesus is just incredulous that he's not educated enough to even wield that. Well, she has no influence. You know, she can try to tell someone anything she wants to tell them, but they don't listen to her, and we'll see why in just a little bit. He is very orthodox. What does the word orthodox mean? Anyone know? Precise. Okay, precise. What else? Okay, a rule follower. Who knows what orthodontics are? Okay, straightening, but you see the word ortho. Orthopedics, right? Ortho. Ortho means right or correct. And dox has the concept of thinking or believing. So it's the right thinking. So when we talk about orthodox, we're talking about those that are straight-laced in their beliefs. And so he is Orthodox. How do we know that? He serves on that council. He is a rabbi, a well-respected teacher among the Jews. In fact, he calls him a ruler of the Jews. So he is Orthodox. She is a Samaritan, following apparently the Samaritan religion, which was a very folksy religion. It was a countryside religion, kind of a hodgepodge of its history. And we'll look at that as well in just a little bit. He was a leader. She's an outcast. She's an outcast from her community. He is a Jew. She's a Samaritan. He's a man. She's a woman. He is righteous for all intents and purposes. As far as we can tell, he's a righteous man. We don't see him with the Pharisaical attitude and legalistic mindset that many of his Jewish compatriots had. So he appears to be righteous. She, on the other hand, is a sinner, which leads to her being an outcast. He seems very satisfied in his religion. He's very satisfied with his relationship with God. Satisfied with his status in the community. But she is very unsatisfied. He came at night, she came at noon. But I think that the payoff of all of this is that they both needed what? They both needed Jesus. In other words, you can come from the highest echelons of society, or you can come from the lowest part of the gutter, but you still need Jesus. You can think that you're right, or you can think that you're a sinner, but you still need Jesus. No matter where you come from, no matter what your education might be, what your status might be, your influence might be, what position you hold or authority you have, everyone still needs Jesus. And so when we started our face-to-face study, one of the things we mentioned at the very beginning was that in these people that he encounters, we see something for ourselves. Now, we may not be like this woman in being an outcast, though we might be, but we see something in her, in ourselves. And it relates us or points us to the fact that we too, like she did, need Jesus. Now, as we get into chapter 4, John chapter 4, now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although he himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And so you have, in this particular region, I know this is not the greatest map in the world, but kind of gets the idea. So Jesus and his disciples are teaching and preaching and baptizing. Where are they baptizing? Do we know? Huh? What river? No, it doesn't say Jordan. Chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. They're in the Judean countryside, in the Aenon, near Salem. And so this Jerusalem, is somewhere around in that area. And there are little, they're tributaries into the Jordan Rift Valley, that come in different places. Does anyone know what they call those? They're wadis, W-A-D-I, a wadi. And so the Wadi Aenon is one of the ones that they're doing, and that's a little tributary that runs right down, just right at the head of the Dead Sea. This, of course, is the Dead Sea. And when we look at the geographic regions of Israel or Palestine, you had this southern region down here was called what? Judea. So go to Judea, Samaria, under the uttermost parts of the world, right? Then this section up here near the Sea of Galilee was called Galilee, right? And the region in the middle was Samaria, right? So Sychar, let me take out Samaria. Sychar is going to be located somewhere around here. Sychar was a little town just outside of Shechem. And Shechem during the Old Testament was a major city. It played heavily into the three fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it was Jacob's daughter, Dinah, who fell in love with Shechem, the son of Hamor. And there was an incident that happened along with that. Well, that's Shechem. And then just outside of Shechem was this, not even miles away, but just a little bit ways off, was this little community called Sychar. During the Maccabean revolt, Shechem was part of the whole against Macedonia. Let's kick them out. And when Macedonia took back over, guess what they did? They pretty much destroyed Shechem. And so the principal city in that region went from Shechem to Sychar. So by the time we get to Jesus, Sychar is a fairly good-sized city. And it is sitting in the very shade of Mount Gerizim. Okay, now there's two mountains in the in the Old Testament, especially prominent in the book of Deuteronomy, that are called the mountain of blessing and the mountain of cursing, right? And so Gerizim was the mountain of blessing. What was the mountain of cursing? Ebal, right. And so the mountain of Ebal and the mountain of Gerizim. And so the picture was that, as Moses is preaching the law in Deuteronomy, some of the congregation are at the foot of Gerizim, some are at the foot of Ebal. And as he would make a declaration, all the people would proclaim, Amen, right? And so, that's part of the preaching. So we come to the Samaritans themselves. The town of Samaria, which was the capital of the region, was a little more centrally located and a little further north of Sychar, and was located a little ways away from the mountains of Gerizim and Ebal. Now, when we look at Samaria as a city, the city of Samaria, it was named by King Omri, who was just shortly after Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that caused Israel to sin. He is the one that sets up Samaria as the capital of the northern kingdom. That's in 1 Kings 16. In 2 Kings 17, the Assyrians, they capture Samaria and the northern kingdom, which basically involved this entire region here, and they capture Samaria. And what does 2 Kings 17 tell us that the Assyrians did?
They took away a lot of the Israelites and they brought other people.
Exactly. So they took the Israelites away, and then they took people from other parts of the kingdoms which they had conquered, and they brought them in there. Why would they do that?
To keep the land from being overgrown, to keep the wild animals.
Okay, right. So the land needed tending, so you can't just take the land out and desert it, right? So why not just leave the Israelites there? If you need someone there.
Well, but this was their policy of assimilation, and they did this over and over to many different nations by bringing part of them in and sending someone else
Right,
where they were, so that the societies would blend. The
Right.
Romans could have learned a little bit from them.
so when I was growing up, we had 40 acres on our farm. I knew every nook and cranny of those 40 acres. I knew every ditch, every ravine, every tree. Now, you take me from there and you go stick me in 40 acres in Nevada, I don't know it. Listen, when I moved here, I'm looking at these trees and I'm saying, what kind of tree is this? It's not the tree I grew up with. It was a natural prison to take captives from one place and take it to a new land because it was disorienting to them. They didn't necessarily know the growing seasons. They didn't know what grains or fruits or trees did well in this type of soil or this type of climate. It wasn't what they grew up with. It wasn't home. And that simple disorientation became a natural land prison. And that's why nations like Assyria did that. If they could take the Israelites out and put them in an unfamiliar place, they would be less apt to try to overthrow or thwart the government. And by the same token, if they can take someone from over here and move them into Palestine, where they're also unfamiliar with growing and housing and all these other things, then it keeps the people in subjection. And that's why these nations did that. So they did that. So here is these new people that are living in this region that are not Jewish blood. They're not Samaritans yet, but they're not Jewish blood. Okay? About 100 years later, the Babylonians take over the southern kingdom, right? Carry them off into Babylonian captivity. How long are they there? 70 years later, they come back, and their homes have been overrun by the remnants of all these other people that the Assyrians left there. Now, the Samaritans claim we are Jews. Okay? The other side of that coin is they are, sometimes you may have hear them called mixed race or mixed breeds, because they were intermarrying with the people that the Assyrians brought in. Anyone that was left over were there. What did Jesus think of them? He called them foreigners, which means he did not consider them to be blood Jews. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, a quick question, because it seems like I remember a point, I believe before Babylon came in, that there were problems in what was in Samaria, northern in Israel. And so they said, well, we don't know what to do to please the gods here. And so they sent back to teach them.
Yes, and that's part of that natural. So many nations were very superstitious. You had the gods of the Babylonians, the gods of the Assyrians, the gods of the Jews. And so if you were in a new land, in a new nation, then we need to appease the gods of this land. That's how they looked at it, how most people who were very superstitious looked at it. And that was part of that natural prison of the land, the disorientation.
Could that be another way they could claim that they were Jews because they have been taught the Jewish ways?
I don't remember that they were proselytizing people like that, but they certainly believed in a Jewish religion. So listen, when they moved in, they wanted to naturally, these foreigners wanted to naturally please the God here, and so they would learn that religion, but they would mix it with their home religion, what we used to do. So what you're seeing is this growing race of people, which if they're mixed race, it's because they have intermarried with the ones that got away. the draft dodgers, as it were. You know, when the Assyrians and the Babylonians are carrying the Jews away, the ones that stayed behind were the ones that escaped to the woods and hid and didn't fight. There's not a high opinion of those people either. And they're the ones that would intermarry with these foreigners. And whose house are they getting? Whose house are they staying in? Well, not theirs. They're living in a house that a Jew had built, you know. And so there was a lot of animosity and a lot of hate between these groups. And so when the Babylonians allowed the Israelites to come back, by then you were starting to see a new religion that was this country, folksy religion of the Samaritans, which dominated this region here, especially around Mount Gerizim. I know my marks are getting way too many now, but let's see, we'll clean it up. The beauty of the whiteboard here. So most of it was centered around Mount Gerizim, which is exactly where Jesus is going in this story, right? They had built a temple. The Samaritans had built a temple. They claimed to worship God. They followed, in fact, the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Even today, there is a manuscript referred to as the Samaritan Pentateuch. It's a little bit different than our Old Testament. Mostly spellings are a little different. Some words sometimes are changed or transposed. One of the biggest or the most significant things is in the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17. God tells them that he's going to put his name on Mount Gerizim and they need to build a temple there. Okay? So this is their, scriptures, and they need to be in that region right here worshiping God. That's how they looked at it. And even today, the Samaritan Pentateuch contains that change. Okay? But by the first century, they didn't look at it as a change. Have you heard of the Maccabees? Okay, Judas Maccabees and those men. So one of Judas's nephew was a guy named John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus was a high priest and was very zealous for the Jewish religion. At first, the Jews didn't like him because he seemed to be siding with the return of the Macedonians and the Seleucids. A little world history here again. So when the Seleucids, Antiochus VII at this point, Antiochus was kind of like a title. The one that we hear of a lot is Antiochus IV, which is the one that prompted the uprising of the Jews and Judas Maccabees. That's one that's more famous to us. But Antiochus VII comes into power and he gets overthrown and killed. And immediately, John Hyrcanus takes that as an opportunity to take back some of the land of Palestine and control that he had given up. So he reigns as a high priest for 30 years. And at the beginning was unliked by the Jews, but by the end was loved by the Jews. Okay? One of the things he does, somewhere around, I've seen a couple of different dates, around either 120 BC or about 111 BC, he goes to Mount Gerizim. He tells the Samaritans, "You're not Jews, quit pretending to be Jews." And he tries to kick them out, and he destroys the temple on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans and the Jews did not get along well at all. And that becomes the backdrop then to which we find Jesus going into the region of Sychar. Now, by the way, there are still Samaritans today who worship on Mount Gerizim. And they still bring out their Samaritan Pentateuch, which dates back to about 1600. They have a priesthood that is from the tribe of Levi, supposedly. They still believe God said he was going to put his name in Gerizim, and that's why we stay here in Gerizim. It's very important to them. So Jesus goes to this town of Sychar, and which is near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Now we go back to Genesis chapter 33 and verse 19 is where we find Jacob actually buying the field from Shechem's father, Hamor. Then in Genesis 48, 21 is where he gives that as an inheritance to Joseph. And then in Joshua 24, at the end of the book, in verse 32, they have Joseph's bones, and they carry him to this region in the shadow of Gerizim near Shechem, where Joseph is buried, which is very near Sychar. So this is a very important place, even in the history of the Jews. Now, many of the things the Jews believed about this area, the Samaritans didn't, because the Samaritans did not believe in the histories, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Samuel, Ezra, did not believe in any of those books, only up through Deuteronomy. So if it came after Deuteronomy in our Bible, the Samaritans did not believe it. Notice the humanity of Jesus is seen here, though, and I think this is one of the themes that runs throughout the book of John is the humanity of Jesus. He is tired. The disciples go into the city because to buy food because he's hungry. He is a man. He's not just a spirit. He is an actual man, and he's sitting at the well, wearied from his journey. It's about noon. Now, if they leave from down here, in this area, because that's where they were baptizing at that time, it's about a day and a half journey from Aenon to Sychar on foot, which lines up perfectly because it's a half a day, right? It's at the 6th hour, which is around noon. So they've traveled all of one day. They've rested for the night. They got up with the dawn, and they've started traveling on the next day. They've gone a day and a half journey now, and Jesus is tired. But it's interesting that it fits right in the context of what John is saying. Now, there was a woman of Samaria. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." This is part of an example, I might say, of the Christian's policy of just say something. We're not going to go into John 4 as a point of evangelistic example or methodology, but man, it makes a great one. But the whole point is just say something. What does he say to her? Give me water. Give me something to drink. And it's enough to, as it were, break the ice. His disciples are gone. What's interesting is that in this particular give me to drink, he is opening the door for her eventually to get to know God. Now, what does it say in verse 4? It says he did what? He what? He needed to pass through Samaria. Well, here's another one of those things. Why did he need to pass through Samaria? And why was that such a great statement? Now, I've heard a lot in my life that the Jews would oftentimes travel transjordanic to go up to the land of Galilee. I don't know if you've ever heard that or not, that the Jews didn't travel through Samaria, they went around. That's really not true. They went through Samaria. They just avoided everyone in Samaria when they went through there. They disliked them, but they were still part of, their welfare was still tied to the welfare of all of Palestine. Now, there are those, usually the Pharisees, the most strict-minded Jews, did make this transjordanic route. But most Jews, especially Galilean Jews that were going back to Jerusalem for the feasts and stuff, they did that. Because they didn't want, you're talking about days are added to your trip. Miles are added to your trip, which takes more resources. Josephus says that going through Samaria like this was the preferred route of the Jews. But there were some Jews that were so scrupulous, refused to do that. Now, it's interesting because it says that his disciples went to buy food. If you were in Samaria and a Samaritan offered you food, as a Jew, you didn't eat it. It was unclean because a Samaritan had touched it. But if you bought that same bowl of food from the Samaritan, it was okay. The Mishnahs, which give us some of the traditions of the Jews, that was one of the traditions that was recorded. It was inappropriate to accept food as a gift from a Samaritan, but it was appropriate to buy food from a Samaritan if you needed to eat. And so notice what his disciples do. They go to buy food from the Samaritans, just as it was appropriate for them to do. Now, what Jesus does, not only, here he is a one who's claiming to be the Son of God, one who obviously is living a very meticulously scrupulous lifestyle, and most Jews would look at that and say, hey, well, he's not going to go through the middle of Jordan or through the middle of Samaria, is he? And he does. What Jesus does is he breaks all rules of Jewish piety, of this made-up buffer zone around himself, and he just follows the law. And in doing so, he needed to go through Samaria. I don't think this need to go through, which, by the way, the phrase that he uses here, needed to go through Samaria, or the ESV has had to go or pass through Samaria, is exactly the same phrase that Josephus uses in talking about the Jews going from Galilee to Jerusalem. They had to pass through Samaria. But I don't think this is anything to do with the resources of Jesus or the time. I think this is divine. Just as, in chapter 3 and verse 14, the Son of Man must be lifted up, or I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. There is a divine imposition placed upon Jesus from God. And I think this is one of those. Jesus had to go through Samaria because he is breaking down these carnal, man-made strictures that were causing division and actually building a barrier against the coming of God into the world. And so he asked this woman. Now she knew, you shouldn't be talking to me. You're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan. You're a man, I'm a woman. Jesus had some respect. She didn't have much respect. How do we know? How do we say, I've mentioned, she's an outcast and stuff. Why do we say things like that about this woman? Naomi?
Because she was there at noon, and that wasn't the normal time to go get her.
Yes. Normally, at this time, it's hot. At that time of day, they would go in the morning. What else?
She was by herself.
Okay, she's by herself. This was one of those social gatherings at the well, and especially for women. And it was like, going to the coffee shop and visiting. This was a time of visiting and sharing, and it was a very important social arrangement. They would all go to the well together and visit. This woman didn't get to go to the well with everybody else. She didn't go at the same time as everybody else. And by the way, there was a well in the city of Sychar. But this well is where? Outside the city. By the way, this well, by the time Jesus is sitting at its edge, is about 2,000 years old. This well still stands today, and it's almost 4,000 years old now. And it still holds water, and it's still about 100 feet deep, so it's a very deep well. But she's out here because she's an outcast from her community. What we learn later is that she's had 5 husbands, and she's living with a man right now. And even among the Samaritans, that was not considered a good thing. There's nothing in the Pentateuch that they held to and believed in that would condone that kind of lifestyle. And that's most likely why she is an outcast. And so while Jesus is respected, at least by his entourage, she's here all alone with no respect. Now, just an aside here, the Old Testament records a couple of instances where men meet women at the well. No, not Moses. Isaac and Jacob. Now, Isaac, it was his servant, actually, that met Rebekah at the well. But it was Jacob who met Rachel at the well. That actually became written into the traditions of the Jews. And again, in their traditional writings, they make reference to, young men, if you're looking for a woman, hang out by the well at the time the women come to the well. And here's Jesus at a well, and a woman comes, and he strikes up a conversation with her. Was she aware of the tradition of the Jews that this was a good way to meet women? And isn't it strange that when Jesus really gets into her life, he asks about her husband? She may be thinking, this man's flirting with me. I don't know, but it is interesting that they used the two examples of the Old Testament to view the world that way by the first century. And here's Jesus in this case. Of course, the whole point of Jesus is he's flying in the face of traditional customs, isn't he? Behavioral norms. He breaks them all down. So then he says to this woman, he pretty much ignores what she says. And this goes back to that chapter 2 and verse 25. Jesus knew what was in man. He knew the hearts of men. He knew what they're thinking. He goes directly to the issue. And he says, if you knew the gift of God and who it is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him for water, and he would have given you living water. And this is a great statement, but Jesus here actually gives us two things. One is the gift, and two is who. That's the bulk of what Jesus is going to teach her. Now, he spends the gift of God, we might say he covers this in 10 through 15. In verse 10, he says, of course, you would have asked him and he would have given you what? What does he call it? Living water. Now, that's a term from the Old Testament. It's used by Jeremiah the prophet a couple of times. They have rejected me, the fountain of living waters. Now, the term was a reference to a spring. And basically in the Old Testament world, in the ancient world, you either captured water in a cistern of some sort, or you had living water, a spring. Now, the more desirable would be what? A spring. By the way, this entire region around Gerizim and Ebal, there are over 80 naturally occurring springs. But they have dug this well deep here, a cistern. But he mentions a living water. Now, she would not have got the reference because she didn't believe in Jeremiah. So that was not their regular scripture. But for his disciples and for John and for John's readers, they're familiar with that. There's a living water that I could have given you if you knew who was asking you this. And then she doesn't quite believe him. The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with. You're asking me for water. How can you give me water?" Right? The well is deep. Where do you get this living water? And are you greater than our father Jacob? And Jesus could have said, yes. He gave us the well to drink and drank from it himself. Are you better than him? Yes. Are you better than his sons? Yes. Better than his cowboys? Yes. But Jesus doesn't do that, does he? He said, everyone drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never be thirsty forever. The water that I give will become in him as a spring of water, welling up, or literally jumping up inside of him to eternal life. And the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water that I may not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water again." Now, water is an important part of this section because he told Nicodemus, you must be born of what? Water and spirit, John 3 and verse 5. He would tell the people at the Feast of Tabernacles in chapter 7 and verses 37 and 39 that if any of you are thirsty, let him come to me and get drink. And in that last reference, he specifically turns that water that he is offering, this living water, into the spirit which he is going to give. And of course, he indicates to Nicodemus even that water is connected to what? Born of the water and the Spirit. He's talking about the presence of God with his followers. I know that because he's going to get to it even more specifically in just a little bit. But that's what he's offering. you will have the presence of God with you. Now, the woman is confused, and she's got a lot of questions about, how can you get this water and all this? But the gift of the water is that this water, he says, will truly slake your thirst, a thirst for God. He's not talking about, obviously, if you drink this glass of water that I give you, you'll never have to drink anything else again, is he? He's obviously using it as a metaphor about something in man that longs for, that thirsts for something greater than ourselves. And that is our innate, God-designed desire to be with God. We all have it. Now, there's a lot of people who try to stuff other things in that hole. And we've talked about that God-shaped hole in our hearts, right? And we try to stick other things in there, but they just don't fit. But Jesus is saying, I've got what fits there. I will give it to you. I will give you satisfaction. This is a woman who can't get no satisfaction, right? Look at her. How many husbands has she had? 5. Let's just pretend for a moment that each one of them died. Who's going to be with this woman again? She's bad news. But there's no indication that they've all died. She's married these men and she's dissatisfied with them. She's dissatisfied with her life. She is coming outside of town to this well all alone when no one will be with her. She is thirsting for something. And Jesus says, I've got the answer. And she still doesn't get it because she says, give me this water. I'm ready for it. Why? Because I don't want to have to work this hard in the heat of the day anymore and come draw water. I don't want to have to be, to deal with being an outcast of my community, having to see the other women get to go to the well together and know that I can't be there. I don't want to even have to drink anymore, so I don't have to face that. That's what Jesus is offering. Nothing had filled her spiritual drought, and Jesus recognized what she needed. Colin Cruz writes, he says, the role of the Spirit is to take Jesus' place in the disciples' lives after he returns to the Father. The Spirit mediates Christ's presence to the disciples, creating a sense of intimacy with the Father and the Son. It is this relationship that lasts to eternal life. And Jesus uses that phrase, to eternal life, throughout the book of John. And it is the human thirst for a relationship with God that the coming of the Spirit satisfies even in the here and now. And I think he's dead on in that. That's what Jesus is. He's not offering water. He is offering the presence of God with mankind. And she misses it because she's too focused on the spiritual. On the physical. And so Jesus goes into the other issue in 16 through 26. He tells her to call her husband. And it's interesting where he puts the word husband, where the emphasis in the grammar is on the word husband. Go call your husband. And she tries to equivocate by saying something that's technically true but misleading. Right? I have no husband. She doesn't. Technically she's right. She doesn't have one. But Jesus knows, and he reveals to her, I know that you've had 5 husbands, and the guy you're sleeping with now is not even your husband. And what does she do? Let's change the subject. I perceive you're a prophet. What about this age-old debate on where we worship? Let's quit talking about my personal life. Things suddenly got uncomfortable for her. Now, she doesn't use the definite article, the prophet, which is significant, because the prophecy of the prophet that the Jews looked forward to came from Deuteronomy. And so in Deuteronomy 18, they're expecting the prophet to come. And remember, the Jews asked John, are you the prophet? Are you the one? She doesn't use that phrase, even though that should be part of the religion that she, or the belief system that she adheres to. She just calls him a prophet. So at best, she's giving him, you know some things that you probably shouldn't know about me. That gives you at least some understanding of the world. So she said, I've got a question for you. Let's talk religion. Now, this was a debate the Jews and the Samaritans had for ages. Where do we worship? And the reason why they had that is because if we go back to our map for a second, the Mount Gerizim, which was somewhere in this area, and let's put red in here so you see it. Mount Gerizim was there. What's in Jerusalem? Mount Moriah. And she says, you say it's your mountain, we say it's our mountain, because Exodus 20 and verse 17 tells us it's our mountain. We built our temple there, y'all destroyed it, but so where is it? Now, we go to John 4, 23 and 24 to talk about true worshipers worship God in spirit and truth, which here again is that introduction of the Spirit. But what does Jesus say? He says, the hour is coming and is now here where this mountain nor that mountain will matter. Why? You see, Mount Moriah was where the temple was. What was inside the temple? The holy place. What was inside the holy place? Yeah, the presence of God. There's coming a time when I will give you this water, this Spirit, the presence of God with you. And it won't matter where you worship, because God will be in you. You see, that's the greatness of her encounter with Jesus, is a promise that God will be with you. That blows me away. I love that aspect of what's coming. He uses that conflict to reinstate or reiterate the gift that he is offering. He looks forward to a worship in the new age. And it's a worship of whole heart with the presence of God. Appreciate your attention tonight. Next week we look at the man at the pool of Bethesda in chapter 5. It's kind of an interesting story there, because it's the first time that Jesus does something great for someone and they throw him under the bus. So